What if the most powerful women in the medieval world were suddenly cast out, stripped of their crowns, their families, and their very homes? What unspeakable betrayals, desperate flights, and harrowing journeys did they endure between the 5th and 15th centuries? Number 10. Isabella of France. The stench of rotting meat and stale ale clung to the smoky halls of Westminster, but to Isabella of France, the true rot lay in the heart of her marriage. She was Queen of England, wife to Edward II, yet her life was a gilded cage, shadowed by her husband's blatant favoritism towards his male companions, particularly Piers Gaveston, and later Hugh Despenser, the younger. The English court had become a theatre of resentment, with Isabella, a daughter of the powerful King Philip IV of France, increasingly sidelined and humiliated. Her royal dignity, a treasure she guarded fiercely, was being chipped away daily, not by enemies from afar, but by the very man she was sworn to. Edward II's infatuation with Hugh Despenser, the younger, a man widely despised by the English barons for his greed and arrogance, reached unprecedented levels. Despenser's influence was absolute, eclipsing the queen, the nobility, and even the laws of the land. Isabella's dower lands, her personal estates that provided her income and independence, were systematically seized by the Despensers, leaving her financially crippled and utterly dependent. She was stripped of her retinue. Her children were taken from her care, and she found herself a prisoner in all but name, her movements restricted, her pleas ignored. As chroniclers like Jean Froissart would later recount, the queen felt herself not just neglected but actively scorned. A queen without a kingdom in her own palace. The breaking point arrived in 1325. Isabella's brother, King Charles IV of France, had seized Edward II's remaining lands in Aquitaine, sparking a minor war. Edward, fearing to leave England due to the instability caused by the Despensers' tyranny, sent Isabella to France to negotiate a peace treaty. This was her chance, a glimmer of hope in a life consumed by despair. She left England not as an ambassador, but as a woman on the precipice of a desperate gamble. Once in France, Isabella's transformation began. She refused to return to England, and her despised husband and his favorites. Her brother Charles IV initially supported her, but the political climate shifted, and he began to pressure her to go back. However, a new alliance formed. Isabella met Roger Mortimer, a powerful English baron who had been exiled by Edward II and the Despensers. Mortimer and Isabella, both united by their hatred of the Despensers and their desire to see Edward II deposed, began a passionate affair. This scandalous alliance, forbidden by all societal norms, became the engine of her future actions. The news of Isabella's defiance and her relationship with Mortimer spread like wildfire across Europe. Edward II, enraged, demanded her return and that of their son, the young Prince Edward, whom Isabella had cleverly kept with her in France, preventing him from being used as a hostage. She used her charm, her royal connections, and her formidable intelligence to gather support. She arranged for her son to be betrothed to Philippa of Hainault, securing military and financial aid from Philippa's father, Count William I of Hainault. This was not merely a romantic entanglement, but a strategic alliance for survival. In September 1326, with a small invasion, force funded by Hainault and bolstered by English exiles loyal to Mortimer, Isabella and Mortimer landed in England at Orwell, Suffolk. This was an invasion, a desperate act of a woman who had been exiled from her own life and was now reclaiming it with a vengeance. Edward II, abandoned by many of his former allies, was captured and later brutally murdered, though Isabella's direct involvement in the murder remains a subject of historical debate, as recorded by historians like Alison Weir in her works on England's queens. Isabella and Mortimer effectively ruled England as regents for her young son, now Edward III. Her exile had ended, but at a terrible price, and it ushered in a period of intense political maneuvering and eventual downfall for Mortimer, orchestrated by her own son. who recognized the dangers of his mother's absolute power. Isabella's exile from England was not merely a physical journey across the Channel, but a dramatic escape from oppression that irrevocably altered the course of English history, cementing her legacy as one of the most formidable and feared queens of the medieval era. Number 9. Elizabeth Woodville. The air at Westminster Palace had grown thick with whispers and veiled threats, a stark contrast to the triumphant cries that had once greeted Elizabeth Woodville as Queen of England. Her journey to the throne was extraordinary, a love match that defied traditional royal protocol, as King Edward IV married her not for political gain but for affection. Despite her being a commoner and a widow with 2 sons, this elevation of the Woodvilles, a relatively minor gentry family, sparked deep resentment among the established nobility, especially Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, known as the Kingmaker, who felt his influence diminished. Elizabeth's position as queen was precarious from the outset. She became the mother of multiple children with Edward IV, including 2 sons, the princes in the Tower, and 5 daughters. Yet the peace of her reign was perpetually threatened by the volatile politics of the Wars of the Roses, a brutal dynastic struggle between the houses of York and Lancaster. The Woodville family's ambition and the king's lavish grants to them fueled the animosity of their rivals, creating a court rife with jealousy and factionalism. The first major upheaval came in 1469, when Warwick, allied with Edward IV's brother George, Duke of Clarence, rebelled against the king. Edward IV was captured, and Warwick briefly attempted to rule in his name. During this tumultuous period, Elizabeth, pregnant with her daughter Margaret, was forced to seek sanctuary in Westminster Abbey. This was not a physical exile from the kingdom, but a harrowing psychological and social exile within its very heart. A desperate flight from danger into the hallowed protection of the church. She stayed there, a queen confined, her power stripped away, her family's fate hanging by a thread, until Edward IV managed to escape Warwick's control and restore himself to power. The chronicles of the time, such as those by Philippe de Comines, hint at the sheer terror and uncertainty that must have gripped the queen and her family during these months. A more profound and devastating exile awaited Elizabeth after Edward IV's sudden death. In April 1483, their eldest son, Edward V, a boy of 12, was heir to the throne. But the peace was shattered by the ambition of Edward IV's youngest brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who quickly moved to seize power. Richard intercepted young King Edward V while he was en route to London, took control of the boy's person, and arrested many of Elizabeth's Woodville relatives, executing some of them. Once again, Elizabeth, along with her remaining children, including her younger son, Richard, Duke of York, and her daughters, fled into sanctuary in Westminster Abbey. This was a true exile from court, from power, and from security. She arrived there not as a queen, but as a desperate mother, clutching her children, seeking refuge from the storm that had engulfed her world. The Abbey became her prison, and her fortress a place where she could only watch as events unfolded outside its sacred walls. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, consolidated his power, declaring Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth invalid and their children illegitimate. He then seized the throne for himself, becoming King Richard III. The 2 young princes, Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, were confined to the Tower of London, their fate unknown, though they are widely believed to have been murdered on Richard III's orders. This period of Elizabeth's sanctuary was one of profound grief and helplessness, as the world she had built crumbled around her. As recorded in the contemporary Croyland Chronicle, the Queen was in a state of utter desolation, her hope for her sons dwindling with each passing day. Her exile and sanctuary continued for over a year, during which time she secretly plotted with Margaret Beaufort, the mother of Henry Tudor, to unite their families and overthrow Richard III. The plan was for Elizabeth's eldest daughter, also named Elizabeth, to marry Henry Tudor, thus merging the rival claims of York and Lancaster. This bold scheme eventually came to fruition when Henry Tudor invaded England, defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, and claimed the crown. Elizabeth Woodville's exile and sanctuary ended with the victory of Henry VII. She emerged. Her daughter married to the new king, and her family's position restored, though her sons were never seen again. She lived out her remaining years, mostly in retirement, but her life was a testament to the brutal political realities of the late medieval period, where a queen, even one beloved by her king, could find herself stripped of everything and forced to seek refuge. Utterly alone, in the face of overwhelming betrayal and ambition. Her exiles, though not to foreign lands, were perhaps more harrowing, for they occurred within the very heart of the kingdom she once ruled. Number 8. Joanna I of Naples. The sun-drenched streets of Naples, usually alive with the clamor of markets and the laughter of its people, held a sinister undercurrent for Queen Joanna I. Her life, though marked by immense royal power, was also a relentless saga of political intrigue. Ascending the throne in 1343, Joanna was a formidable, intelligent woman, but her reign was perpetually destabilized by internal feuds among her Angevin cousins and the aggressive ambitions. Her first major crisis and the catalyst for her first dramatic exile came swiftly and brutally. In 1345, her first husband, Andrew of Hungary, was murdered at Avarsa, strangled and thrown from a window. The finger of suspicion immediately pointed at Joanna herself, or at least at her closest advisors, and perhaps her lover, Louis of Taranto, whom she later married. The circumstances were murky, but the public outcry and the fury of Andrew's brother, King Louis I of Hungary, were undeniable. Louis I, known as Louis the Great, vowed vengeance for his brother's death and assembled a powerful army. As Louis I's forces marched south, sweeping through the kingdom of Naples with a relentless advance, Joanna found herself trapped between a vengeful foreign monarch and a populace increasingly convinced of her guilt. She had few allies, and her own barons were reluctant to rally behind a queen accused of regicide. The threat was immediate and existential. The vibrant court she had cultivated crumbled around her as panic set in. In January 1348, as Louis I's army approached Naples, Joanna made a desperate decision. Along with her second husband, Louis of Taranto, she fled the city by ship, abandoning her capital and her kingdom to the Hungarian invaders. Her destination was Provence, specifically Avignon, then the seat of the papacy. This was not a voluntary departure, but a forced exile, a desperate scramble for survival in the face of an overwhelming military threat and widespread public condemnation. The journey across the Mediterranean would have been fraught with peril. A queen stripped of her power, dependent on the mercy of the waves and the political currents of Europe. Once in Avignon, Joanna made a calculated gamble. She sought an audience with Pope Clement VI, intending to clear her name of the murder accusation. This was a bold move, as the Pope was a powerful figure who could either condemn her or legitimize her. She presented her case eloquently, arguing her innocence and asserting her hereditary right to her kingdom. In exchange for the Pope's acquittal and continued support, Joanna agreed to sell Avignon, a city that was technically part of her Provençal territories, to the papacy. For a surprisingly low sum, this deal, while financially disadvantageous, secured her political survival. The Pope, perhaps swayed by her charm, her arguments, or the substantial sum, formally acquitted her of Andrew's murder. As noted by historians of the Angevin dynasty, this acquittal was a crucial moment, granting her a much-needed moral and political victory. Armed with papal absolution, Joanna began to plot her return. Louis I of Hungary, having ravaged Naples and found little evidence directly linking Joanna to the murder, eventually withdrew his forces due to the Black Death epidemic sweeping across Europe. In 1348, she returned to Naples, reclaiming her throne and her kingdom. Her first exile had been a success, a testament to her political acumen and resilience. However, Joanna's life was a cycle of crises and precarious returns. She faced multiple subsequent periods of exile, or near exile. Later in her reign, she endured further invasions, often instigated by relatives or ambitious pretenders. She had to flee Naples again in 1350 due to another Hungarian invasion, and later during the Western Schism, she sided with the Avignon Pope against the Roman Pope. This decision brought the wrath of Pope Urban VI upon her, who excommunicated her and declared her throne forfeit. In 1381, Urban VI appointed her cousin Charles of Durazzo as the new king of Naples. Charles invaded, besieged Joanna in Castelnuovo, in Naples, and eventually captured her. This was her final and most tragic exile. She was imprisoned, and in 1382 she was murdered, most likely by Charles's order, avenging the death of his uncle Andrew 40 years earlier. Her life, documented in the detailed chronicles of her reign, shows a queen who, despite her efforts, could never fully escape the shadow of the murder accusation and the brutal power struggles that defined her medieval world. Joanna's story is one of relentless flight and precarious return, a queen who lived in a constant state of threatened exile until it finally consumed her. Number 7. Margaret of Anjou. The world of Margaret of Anjou, Queen of England, was a tempest of political ambition and dynastic conflict, utterly consumed by the Wars of the Roses. She arrived in England in 1445, a proud and fiercely intelligent French princess, to marry the gentle and pious King Henry VI. But the English throne was a poisoned chalice. Henry VI suffered from periods of mental incapacitation, leaving a power vacuum that Margaret, despite being a woman in a male-dominated world, was compelled to fill to protect her husband's interests and their son's future. Her reign was marked by growing factionalism between the Lancastrians, her husband's side, and the Yorkists. Led by Richard, Duke of York, Margaret quickly became the de facto leader of the Lancastrian cause, a formidable figure who commanded armies, negotiated treaties, and fiercely defended her royal prerogative. Chroniclers of the era, such as those collected in Paston letters, often depicted her as a ruthless, determined woman, a she-wolf protecting her cub, her son Edward of Westminster, from the encroaching Yorkist threat. This portrayal, while perhaps biased, shows her ferocity and her willingness to fight for her family's claim. The first major turning point in her dramatic saga came with the Battle of Northampton in 1460, where the Lancastrian forces were defeated, and King Henry VI was captured by the Yorkists. Margaret, with her young son, fled the battlefield, scrambling for safety. This marked the beginning of her first significant period of exile, not from England entirely, but from the royal court and the semblance of power she had wielded. She traveled north, rallying loyal Lancastrian forces, transforming herself from queen to warlord, desperately fighting to reclaim her husband and her son's inheritance. Her efforts paid off, albeit temporarily. The Battle of Wakefield in December 1460, Margaret's forces decisively defeated the Yorkists, and Richard, Duke of York, was killed. However, the victory was short-lived. York's son, Edward, a brilliant military commander, gathered his forces and, after another series of brutal battles, was crowned King Edward IV in 1461. With Edward IV on the throne, Margaret of Anjou became a queen in exile. She and her son were forced to flee England, seeking refuge in her native France. This was a true exile. A queen, a mother driven from her kingdom, her husband a prisoner, her son dispossessed. She landed in Scotland first, then traveled to France seeking support from her cousin King Louis XI. Her life became one of constant supplication and negotiation, a queen reduced to begging for military aid and funds to reclaim her throne. Her exile in France was a period of intense frustration and political maneuvering. She was impoverished, relying on the grudging hospitality of Louis XI, who was more interested in his own political gains than in genuinely restoring the Lancastrian cause. For years, she tirelessly plotted, her hopes rising and falling with each new rumor and diplomatic turn. She lived a life of deprivation compared to her former royal existence, driven by an unyielding desire to see her son on the English throne. The challenges of raising an army, convincing reluctant allies, and maintaining her reputation were immense. In 1470, a stunning turn of events occurred. Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, the kingmaker who had once been Edward IV's strongest supporter, had a falling out with the Yorkist king. Warwick, now desperate for power, allied with his former enemy, Margaret of Anjou. A marriage was arranged between Margaret's son Edward and Warwick's daughter, Anne Neville. This unlikely alliance aimed to restore Henry VI to the throne. Margaret and Warwick launched an invasion of England for a brief few months in 1470 to 71. Henry VI was indeed restored, a puppet king under Warwick's control, but Edward IV returned quickly from his own brief exile, and the tide turned again. At the Battle of Tewkesbury in May 1471, the Lancastrian forces were utterly annihilated. Margaret's beloved son, Edward of Westminster, was killed in battle. Her hopes, her reason for fighting, were crushed. Margaret herself was captured shortly after the battle. She was held prisoner for 5 years, a queen without a kingdom, mourning her husband, who died in the Tower of London, likely murdered, and her only child. Her life in England had been a relentless struggle, a constant battle against forces determined to see her family destroyed. Her final exile began in 1476, when King Louis XI of France paid a ransom for her release. She returned to France, not as a queen, but as a broken woman stripped of her family and her purpose. She lived out her remaining years in quiet retirement, far from the courts and battles that had defined her life. Margaret of Anjou's exile was not a single event, but a series of desperate flights and returns, each one more devastating than the last, until she was finally exiled from any hope of a royal future, a testament to the brutal cost of medieval queenship. Number 6. Udosia Macroatissa. The grand halls of the Byzantine imperial palace, usually echoing with the measured tread of courtiers and the whispers of intrigue, must have felt like a tomb to Udosia Macroatissa. She was an empress wife of Emperor Constantine, the 10th Tukos, and after his death in 1067, she became regent for her young sons, Michael VII and Constantius. This was a position of immense power, but also one of profound vulnerability, especially for a woman in the tumultuous Byzantine Empire, constantly threatened by internal dissent and external enemies. Udosia was a woman of intellect and considerable political skill, but the empire faced a dire military crisis. The Seljuk Turks were encroaching on Byzantine territory, and the defenses were crumbling. It quickly became clear that a strong military leader was needed, someone capable of uniting the empire and facing down its formidable foes. As regent, Udosia had sworn an oath to her dying husband never to remarry, an oath designed to protect her son's claim to the throne. Yet the survival of the empire itself depended on breaking that very oath. In 1068, recognizing the urgent need for a new emperor with military prowess, Udosia made a controversial decision. She chose Romanos Diogenes, a respected general, to be her new husband and co-emperor. This was a strategic marriage intended to save the empire, and it required a special dispensation from the Patriarch in the Senate, who released her from her earlier vow. The marriage temporarily stabilized the empire, and Romanos IV embarked on military campaigns against the Seljuks. However, Romanos IV's military efforts ultimately failed. At the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, a catastrophic defeat for the Byzantines, Romanos IV was captured by the Seljuk Sultan, Alp Arslan. The news sent shockwaves through Constantinople. With the emperor captured, the Dukas faction, Eudocia's own family, saw an opportunity to restore their full power and remove Romanos from the throne. Led by John Ducas, Constantine X's brother, they swiftly moved against Eudocia, despite her efforts to maintain order and even raise a new army to rescue Romanos. Eudocia was powerless against the swift and ruthless coup orchestrated by her brother-in-law. John Ducas capitalized on the public sphere and Romanos's absence. He accused Eudocia of mismanaging the empire and seized power, declaring her young son, Michael VII, as the sole emperor. Eudocia, the once powerful empress and regent, was swiftly stripped of her authority. Her imperial robes were replaced by the simple habit of a nun. She was forced to enter a monastery, specifically the Convent of the Mother of God, as a nun, a common fate for deposed empresses in the Byzantine Empire. This was a profound and dramatic exile, not just from the palace but from secular life itself. It was a complete obliteration of her identity as a ruler and a woman of power. The monastic cell became her new inescapable prison, a symbol of her political defeat and her forced removal from the public eye. Historians like John Julius Norwich chronicle these turbulent years, detailing the relentless political machinations that often led to such exiles for Byzantine rulers. Her exile was not without its ironies. Romanos IV, after being ransomed by Alp Arslan, attempted to return to Constantinople to reclaim his throne. However, he was intercepted by the Ducas forces, blinded, and eventually died from his injuries. Eudocia remained in the monastery, a silent witness to the continued power struggles of her family. Yet her story was not entirely over. In a surprising turn of events, some years later, she was briefly brought out of her monastic exile. When her son Michael VII proved to be an ineffectual ruler and faced a serious rebellion, Eudocia was summoned back to Constantinople in 1078 by Alexius I Komnenos, who hoped to use her influence to stabilize the empire. She was not fully restored to power, but her brief return from the monastic life, however temporary, underscored her enduring symbolic importance. However, her return was short-lived, and she soon retreated back to her monastic life, where she died many years later. Udosia Macroatissa's exile was a classic example of the precarious nature of power in the Byzantine Empire, where the highest position could swiftly turn into the most confined and iceless political rivals and the shifting tides of war. Number 5. Irene of Athens. The story of Irene of Athens, the formidable Byzantine empress, is one of audacious ambition, ruthless power, and a dramatic fall from grace that culminated in a lonely exile. She arrived in Constantinople from Athens in 769 to marry Emperor Leo IV. Upon Leo's death in 780, Irene became regent for her young son, Constantine VI, immediately establishing herself as a force to be reckoned with. Irene was a devout iconophile, meaning she supported the veneration of religious images, a practice that had been banned by previous emperors in the iconoclast controversy. Her regency was largely focused on restoring icon veneration, a policy that sparked fierce opposition from the iconoclast faction, particularly within the army. She skillfully navigated these treacherous waters, consolidating her power by outmaneuvering rebellious generals and securing the support of the Patriarch of Constantinople. As recorded by chroniclers like Theophanes, the confessor Irene was a master of political manipulation, using her intelligence and cunning to achieve her aims. As her son, Constantine VI, grew older, he chafed under his mother's dominant regency. He desired to rule in his own right and resented Irene's continued control. A bitter power struggle ensued between mother and son. Irene, unwilling to relinquish power, had her son arrested and held him prisoner. She then forced the army and the populace to swear an oath that they would never accept her son as emperor while she was alive. This was a desperate attempt to cement her authority, a shocking display of maternal ruthlessness. However, Constantine VI, once released, managed to rally support and attempted to assert his authority. Conflict escalated, culminating in a brutal act of vengeance. In 797, Irene orchestrated the capture of her own son. On her orders, he was seized and blinded in the very palace where he had been born, in the room known as the Porphyry Chamber, a space typically reserved for imperial births. This horrific act not only removed her rival, but also made her the undisputed sole ruler of the Byzantine Empire. A woman ruling in her own right, unprecedented in Roman and Byzantine history. She signed official documents as Basilissa, Empress, rather than Basilissa, Kai Augusta, Empress, and Augusta, which implied a male co-ruler. This bold claim to sole rule further cemented her unique and controversial position. Irene reigned for 5 years as sole empress, a period marked by both political stability and military setbacks. She attempted to secure alliances with the West, even famously considering a marriage to Charlemagne, the powerful king of the Franks, an idea that could have unified East and West and reshaped the political landscape of Europe. However, such ambitious plans came to nothing, and the economic situation of the empire suffered under her rule. Her downfall came swiftly and unexpectedly. Despite her ruthlessness, Irene had managed to alienate many of her former allies, particularly those in the bureaucracy and the military, who feared her arbitrary rule and her unpredictable. On October 31st, 802, a conspiracy led by the Minister of Finance, Nikephoros, suddenly struck. Irene was overthrown in a bloodless coup. Conspirators, with the support of parts of the army and civil administration, proclaimed Nikephoros as the new emperor, Nikephoros I. The events were so sudden that Irene, caught unaware, had no opportunity to resist. Irene was immediately arrested, stripped of her imperial regalia and her vast wealth. The empress who had blinded her own son and ruled an empire was sent into exile. Her destination was Lesbos, a large island in the Aegean Sea. This was a deliberate choice, far from Constantinople, isolated and with no opportunity for her to rally support or plot a return. She was confined to a monastery there, living out her days in stark contrast to the opulence and power she had once commanded. The fall was complete and devastating. The once feared and powerful empress, now a mere nun, lived for only a short time in exile, dying on Lesbos in 803, less than a year after her deposition. Her death, in obscurity, far from the imperial capital she had dominated, marked the dramatic end of a reign that had pushed the boundaries of medieval queenship to its absolute limit. Irene of Athens' exile was a stark reminder that even the most absolute power in the Byzantine Empire could be fleeting, and that the path to the throne was often paved with betrayal and ended in lonely isolation. Number 4. Adelaide of Burgundy. The young Empress Adelaide of Burgundy knew the sting of betrayal long before her dramatic exile. Born into royalty around 931, she was the daughter of King Rudolph II of Burgundy. At the tender age of 16, she married Lothair, the second king of Italy. Their marriage was short-lived and tragic. In 950, Lothair died, widely believed to have been poisoned by his powerful rival, Berengar II of Italy. This left Adelaide a widow with a young daughter, Emma, and a kingdom in turmoil. Berengar II, who had already seized the opportunity to crown himself king of Italy, harbored a sinister ambition to legitimize his claim and solidify his power by forcing Adelaide to marry his son, Adalbert. This would effectively transfer all of Adelaide's claims and influence directly into his family's hands. For Adelaide, this was not just a political marriage, but a forced union with the family she suspected had murdered her husband. A prospect of utter subjugation. Adelaide refused. Her defiance, a bold act for a young woman in a dangerous political landscape, enraged Berengar. He did not tolerate challenges to his authority. He swiftly imprisoned Adelaide. Initially at the fortress of Garda on the shores of Lake Garda, this was her dramatic exile, a forced removal from her royal court, from her daughter, and from any semblance of freedom. She was stripped of her possessions, confined to a small, desolate room, denied contact with the outside world. This was not a pleasant banishment, but a harsh captivity, a desperate attempt by Berengar to break her will and force her compliance. Conditions of her imprisonment, though not extensively detailed in all chronicles, were certainly designed to exert maximum pressure. Chroniclers of the time, such as Widukind of Corvey, describe her suffering and determination during this period. But Adelaide was not a woman to be easily broken. Despite her confinement, she was resourceful. The details of her escape vary slightly among historical accounts, adding to the legend, but the core narrative remains consistent. It is believed that she managed to communicate with a sympathetic priest or servant who helped her dig a tunnel or find a hidden passage out of her cell. She then fled the fortress, possibly crossing the lake in a fishing boat disguised in simple clothing. Her escape was a perilous journey. She was pursued by Berengar's soldiers, hunted across the rugged landscape of northern Italy. She sought refuge in various castles, often moving under the cover of darkness, relying on the loyalty of local lords who still harbored respect for her family. One such safe haven was the castle of Canossa, a powerful stronghold held by Bishop Adelard. Here she found temporary sanctuary, but she knew she could not remain there indefinitely. Berengar's wrath was immense, and he would not rest until she was recaptured or destroyed. From Canossa, Adelaide sent a desperate plea for help across the Alps to Otto I, the powerful king of Germany, who was already expanding his influence into Italy. Otto, known as Otto the Great, saw in Adelaide's plight a perfect opportunity to intervene in Italian affairs and assert his own dominance. He immediately responded, leading a powerful army into Italy in 951, ostensibly to rescue the imprisoned queen. Otto marched on Pavia, the capital of the Lombard kingdom, where Berengar was forcing him to flee. Otto then met Adelaide, and they were married in Pavia in 951. This union, born out of dramatic rescue and political expediency, made Adelaide not just Queen of Italy, but soon Empress of the Holy Roman Empire, a title she received when Otto was crowned emperor by the Pope in Rome in 962. Her exile and subsequent rescue had propelled her to the highest position in Western Europe. Adelaide's life continued to be one of influence and occasional hardship. She served as a powerful co-ruler with Otto, and later as regent for her young grandson, Otto III, a period that saw further political struggles. Her dramatic escape and subsequent elevation became a foundational myth for the burgeoning Holy Roman Empire, emphasizing the divine providence that had led her to Otto and their subsequent reign. Her story is a powerful testament to a medieval queen who, through her courage and resilience, turned a desperate exile into a triumph that shaped the course of European history. Number 3. Eleanor of Aquitane. The whispers began subtly, then grew into a roaring storm. Eleanor of Aquitane, one of the most powerful women of the Middle Ages, found herself entangled in a web of political intrigue and familial betrayal that would lead to her dramatic and lengthy imprisonment. She was Duchess of Aquitaine, in her own right, Queen of France by her first marriage to Louis VII, and then Queen of England through her second tumultuous marriage to Henry II Plantagenet. Her life was defined by extraordinary power, immense wealth, and an unyielding will. Eleanor brought vast territories to Henry II, forming the core of the sprawling Angevin Empire that stretched from Scotland to the Pyrenees. Together, they had a large family, including 4 sons, who would eventually be known as the Devil's Brood for their constant warring with their father. The early years of their marriage were marked by dynamic collaboration, but soon their strong personalities clashed. Henry's numerous affairs, particularly with Rosamund Clifford, openly flaunted at court, deeply insulted Eleanor. More critically, Henry's refusal to grant his sons any real authority or land, despite their age, sparked widespread resentment which Eleanor, deeply protective of her children, exploited. The breaking point came in 1173. Eleanor, along with her eldest living sons, Henry the Young King, Richard the Lionheart, and Geoffrey openly rebelled against Henry II. This was not merely a domestic dispute, it was a major political and military uprising that shook the Angevin Empire to its foundations. The sons, frustrated by their lack of power, sought to carve out their own domains, and Eleanor, estranged from Henry, and perhaps seeking to assert her own autonomy, actively encouraged and supported their rebellion. She traveled through Aquitaine, raising support and funds, urging her vassals to rise against their father, Henry II, a ruthless and formidable king, acted swiftly and decisively to crush the rebellion. His armies were superior and his political intelligence network far-reaching. By 1174, the rebellion was suppressed. Eleanor, attempting to flee from Poitiers to her old realm in France, was intercepted and captured near Poitiers by Henry's forces. This moment marked the beginning of her incredibly long and dramatic exile, a period of imprisonment that would last for approximately 16 years. Her imprisonment was unique. She was not sent to a foreign land or locked away in a dungeon. Instead, she was held in various English castles, including Winchester, Salisbury, and ultimately Winchester, and then Old Sarum under house arrest. Though confined, she was not stripped of all royal dignity. She had attendants, access to books, and her own apartments, but she was entirely cut off from political life, from her children, except for occasional controlled visits, and from her vast lands in Aquitaine. This was a sophisticated form of royal exile, designed to neutralize her immense influence and prevent her from inciting further rebellion. Historians like Ralph V. Turner, in his works on Eleanor, emphasized that her confinement was a means of control rather than simple punishment. During her imprisonment, Eleanor remained a symbol of defiance and a rallying point for her sons, even as they continued their own struggles with their father. She watched from her isolated vantage point as Henry II wrestled with his difficult sons, as her favorite son Richard grew into a formidable warrior, and as the political landscape of Europe shifted. She endured the death of her sons, Henry the Young King and Geoffrey, while still a prisoner. Her release finally came after Henry II's death in 1189. Her favorite son, Richard the Lionheart, inherited the throne and immediately ordered his mother's release. Eleanor emerged from her long confinement not as a broken woman, but as a seasoned and powerful matriarch. She was in her late 60s, but her mind was as sharp as ever, and her influence was undiminished. Upon her release, Eleanor immediately took control. She oversaw the smooth transition of power to Richard, traveled across England to ensure his succession was secure, and then, with characteristic vigor, helped manage the Angevin Empire, while Richard was away on the Third Crusade. She raised his ransom when he was captured in Austria, and even traveled to Germany herself to bring him home. She was a constant political force, her long exile having honed her strategic mind rather than dulled it. Eleanor of Aquitaine's long imprisonment was a dramatic exile from her political life, her family, and her freedom. Yet her story is one of extraordinary resilience, of a queen who endured years of confinement only to emerge with her power and spirit intact, forever shaping the destinies of England and France. Number 2. Judith of Bavaria. The imperial court of Charlemagne's son, Louis the Pious, was supposed to be a place of stability and pious devotion. But for Judith of Bavaria, Louis' second wife and Empress of the Franks, it became a stage for relentless political infighting. A battleground where she found herself repeatedly exiled and restored. Judith was intelligent, beautiful, and ambitious, a stark contrast to her devout and somewhat indecisive husband. She bore Louis a son, Charles, who would later be known as Charles the Bald, and her fierce determination to secure a good inheritance for him became the central catalyst for her dramatic experiences. The problem for Judith was Louis's sons from his first marriage, Lothair, Pippin, and Louis the German. They were already grown men with established territories and a clear understanding of their inheritance from the Ordinatio Imperii, a decree that outlined the division of the empire upon their father's death. The birth of Charles and Judith's undeniable influence over Louis threatened this arrangement. Judith's efforts to carve out a new kingdom, Swabia, later West Francia, for Charles, known as Charles's portion, ignited a bitter and protracted civil war among the imperial family. The elder son saw Judith as a manipulative interloper, a threat to their established rights and the stability of the empire. The first major crisis for Judith came in 830. The resentment among the elder sons, particularly Lothair, exploded into open rebellion. They accused Judith of various misdeeds, including adultery, and using witchcraft to influence the emperor. These accusations, though likely unfounded and purely politically motivated, served as a pretext to remove her from power and undermine Louis. The rebellion gained significant support from the nobility, and even some churchmen who were frustrated with Louis's rule and sympathetic to the claims of the elder sons. Louis the Pious was captured, and Judith was arrested. She was stripped of her imperial robes and her personal wealth, and forced to take the veil. As a nun, this was her first dramatic exile, a forced removal from the court and from secular life itself. She was sent to a monastery in Poitiers, a distant and isolated location, effectively imprisoned and neutralized. This was a common tactic in the Frankish world to remove inconvenient women from the political scene. The Annals Bertiniani, a key contemporary chronicle, details the depth of the betrayal and the swiftness of her removal. However, Judith's story is one of remarkable resilience and political comebacks. Louis the Pious, despite his weakness, still had loyalists, and his sons, having seized power, soon fell out among themselves. Taking advantage of the shifting alliances, Louis was restored to power in 831. With his restoration came Judith. She was dramatically brought back from her monastic exile, her vows annulled, and she resumed her place as empress. This was a powerful statement of her political importance and Louis's devotion, but the peace was short-lived. The struggle over Charles's portion continued, leading to further rebellions. In 833, the three elder sons united again, this time with even greater support, including that of Pope Gregory IV. At the Field of Lies near Colmar, Louis the Pious's army deserted him. Swayed by the Pope and his sons, Louis was again captured, and Judith was once more seized. This time her exile was even more severe. She was sent to the monastery of Santa Radegund in Tortona, Italy, a much more distant and harsher confinement, indicating the son's determination to keep her permanently out of the picture. Her young son Charles was also separated from her and confined in a monastery. This second exile was arguably more desperate as it seemed permanent, a complete separation from her family and any hope of regaining influence. Chronicles of Nithard, another contemporary historian and grandson of Charlemagne, paint a grim picture of the political chaos and personal torment of the imperial family. Yet again, the brothers' unity fractured. Lothair, having taken the most power, alienated Pippin and Louis the German. This internal strife created another opening for Judith's return. In 834, Louis the German and Pippin, realizing Lothair's unchecked ambition was a threat to them all, rallied forces and restored their father to the throne for the second time. And with Louis's return, Judith was once more brought back from exile, a testament to her husband's enduring love and her own remarkable capacity to survive and re-enter the political fray. Judith continued to exert significant influence until Louis the Pious's death in 840. Even after his death, she continued to fight for her son Charles's inheritance, playing a crucial role in the subsequent divisions of the Frankish Empire that ultimately led to the Treaty of Verdun in 843, which established the kingdoms that would evolve into France. Judith of Bavaria's repeated exiles and dramatic returns illustrate the brutal, unpredictable nature of medieval court politics, where power could be gained and lost in an instant, and need to claw her way back to influence against all odds. Number 1. Empress Matilda. The winter winds whipping across the English Channel carried not just the spray of the sea, but the bitter taste of thwarted ambition and deep injustice for Empress Matilda. Born in 1102, daughter of King Henry I of England and granddaughter of William the Conqueror, she was destined for a life of unprecedented power and privilege. As a child, she was sent to Germany to marry Emperor Henry V of the Holy Roman Empire, a union that earned her the title of Empress. Upon his death, she returned to England only to face an unexpected and brutal challenge to her destiny. Her father, King Henry I, having lost his only legitimate son, William Adelaide, in the tragic sinking of the White Ship, had taken an extraordinary step. He made his barons swear an oath to recognize Matilda as his rightful heir to the English throne and his lands in Normandy. This was a revolutionary act in an age when female succession was almost unheard of. But the solemn oaths of the barons proved to be as fickle as the English weather. Upon Henry I's death in 1135, the promises vanished like smoke. Her cousin, Stephen of Blois, disregarding his oath and seizing the moment swiftly, crossed the Channel, garnered support, and had himself crowned King of England. This was the moment Matilda's dramatic lifelong exile began. She was not physically banished from England by force, but her rightful claim to the throne was usurped, effectively exiling her from her inheritance and plunging England into a brutal civil war that would last for nearly 2 decades, known as the Anarchy. Matilda was in Normandy at the time, still mourning her father and preparing for her rightful ascension. The news of Stephen's coronation was a devastating blow. From that moment, her life became a relentless struggle to reclaim what was hers. She was a claimant, a woman of royal blood, but without a throne, effectively a queen in exile from her own kingdom. She spent years in Normandy consolidating her power base, raising funds, and gathering supporters, including her powerful half-brother, Robert, Earl of Gloucester. The challenges were immense. Medieval society was deeply patriarchal, and many barons were unwilling to accept a woman as their liege lord. Chronicles of the period, such as William of Malmesbury's Historia Novella, vividly portray the chaos and division that engulfed England during this time. In 1139, after years of preparation and diplomatic maneuvering, Matilda finally landed in England, bringing her fight directly to Stephen. This was no ordinary return, but an invasion, a desperate attempt to reclaim her stolen crown. For the next decade, England was ravaged by constant warfare between Matilda's forces and Stephen's. Castles were besieged, lands were plundered, and the country was plunged into utter chaos. Matilda experienced moments of triumph and devastating setbacks. In 1141, her forces captured King Stephen at the Battle of Lincoln. For a brief period, she was acknowledged as Lady of the English, and she even entered London, seemingly on the verge of claiming her crown. However, her harshness and inability to win over the wary Londoners and a powerful faction within the church quickly turned the tide against her. She was besieged in Westminster and forced to flee the city, her coronation plans shattered. This episode led to one of her most dramatic personal exiles within England. Later, in 1141, she was besieged in Oxford Castle by Stephen's resurgent forces. Surrounded and running out of supplies, Matilda faced capture or starvation. In a daring act of escape, she reportedly slipped out of the castle under cover of night, dressed in white to blend in with the snow, and crossed the frozen Thames on foot, escaping to safety in Wallingford. This perilous flight, risking her life in the dead of winter, underscored the desperate stakes of her struggle. Despite her tenacity, Matilda was never crowned Queen of England. The war dragged on, a stalemate of attrition. Her forces ebbed and flowed, but she was unable to deliver a decisive blow. By 1148, exhausted and seeing no immediate path to victory, she returned to Normandy, ending her active campaign in England. This was her final self-imposed exile from the English battlefield, a recognition that the direct fight for the crown was lost. However, her legacy was far from over. From Normandy, she continued to manage her family's interests and groom her son, Henry Plantagenet, for the throne. She meticulously instructed him, providing him with the political education and strategic guidance he would need. And it was through her son that she ultimately achieved her goal. Henry invaded England in 1153, and after further campaigning, Stephen, weary of war and having lost his own son, agreed to the Treaty of Wallingford or Westminster. This treaty stipulated that Stephen would remain king until his death, but that Henry, Matilda's son, would succeed him. When Stephen died in 1154, Henry Plantagenet ascended the throne as Henry II, founding the powerful Plantagenet dynasty. Matilda, the empress who had fought so long and so hard, lived out her remaining years in Normandy, a powerful and respected figure who advised her son, ensuring the stability of his vast empire. She never returned to England, never formally held the crown, but her dramatic exile and relentless fight had ultimately secured the throne for her lineage. Empress Matilda's story is a compelling testament to the strength and enduring influence of a medieval queen who, though exiled from her throne, never abandoned her claim and ultimately shaped the course of English history.